Good afternoon, brothers and sisters. I wish I could begin this message with the words I use virtually every Sunday. Please open your Bibles to such and such. However, I've been asked to speak on another subject, although I would much rather preach the Bible. Curtis McLean asked me to speak on two 19th century movements that adversely affected churches in general and evangelicals in particular. And they did that by introducing contemporary philosophies of their day, and that this would be a lesson to us to be on our guard in our day. I would much rather preach the Bible. But as old Marshal Matt Dillon used to say, Festus, it's a dirty job, but somebody's got to do it. Not my area of expertise, but I do know a little bit. I hope I don't sound too much like a college lecturer. What I plan to do is this. I'll give a brief historical survey and then a summary of the positions and the people involved, one in particular, and then a biblical and theological evaluation, and then conclude with some practical lessons that we can learn and apply today. I'll give you a brief summary of what we're going to do by answering 5 questions. And for you preachers, if you're ever at a loss for how to put together an outline, here's your 5 points. It can be applied to anything. Not the 5 points of Calvinism, but 5 questions. Who, what, where, when, and why. Those basic journalistic questions every journalist has to answer. And this is what I'll be doing this afternoon. Who? Friedrich Schleiermacher. What? The rise of theological liberalism. Where? Germany. When? Early 19th century. Why? It arose as the rejection of historic Reformation biblical orthodoxy as a reaction against philosophical rationalism by bringing in theological romanticism. You say, what is all that? Listen for the next hour and take notes. Let's first do a background historical for the historical setting, or what the Germans would say is the Sitzenleben, the setting in life. It didn't happen in a vacuum. There were certain undercurrents before, and now it erupts in the same thing today. We are called upon to address our Sitzenleben, and we need to know which way the wind is blowing so that we can take a firm stand and not be blown in the wind, as the Bible says, not be tossed to and fro by every wind of doctrine. So this is the soil in which the seeds of German theological liberalism took root. Let's go back long before that time, the Reformation. Now, some of you are probably better able to sum up the Reformation than I am, but I'll give a brief summary. For over 1,000 years, Roman Catholicism had dominated the scene in, quote, Christian Europe. Not very Christian, more Catholic. But it dominated it. And then during the 16th century, mainly starting in Germany, there was a revolt. Now, there were already some predecessors before that, Thomas Bradwardine, Wycliffe, Huss, people like this. But now it erupts with a German monk by the name of Martin Luther. And it began to spread in different places. It was, by the way, that was the greatest revival in Christian history since the time of the apostles. People were being saved by the hundreds, thousands. Churches were dramatically renovated and brought back to the true gospel. Well, in that first generation of the Reformation, starting in the early 1500s, there were 3 branches that could be identified, and there would be sub-branches within them. But first, there would be the Lutheran branch that started with Luther in Germany, and it began to grow with his assistants, Melanchthon and Chemnitz, later Kenstedt, Gerhard, and the other great Lutherans. And then there is the next branch, the Anabaptists, who many of us would look to as some of our forefathers. These were ones, for example, that did not believe in the baptism of infants, but only of believers who could make a legitimate biblical profession of faith. And they began to spread from Switzerland over to Holland, even over to Eastern Europe and various places, usually being severely persecuted along the way. The third branch would be called the Reformed. Now let me clarify something. There's a little bit of difference between the terms Reformation and Reformed. Reformation refers to the whole Reformation. Reformed refers to one branch, usually called the Calvinist branch, but it actually begun by Zwingli a generation earlier. Now this mainly started in Switzerland, spread in France, took root in Holland, England, and Scotland and a few other places, such as Hungary. The Lutherans mainly dominated like in Germany, Scandinavia, but you can see how they were setting out their geographical territories, but then sometimes they would overlap. Well, one of those overlaps was between the Lutherans and the Reformed, or the Calvinists, in southern Germany. It's as if the Lutherans were saying, this is our territory. And the other one said, well, all territories belong to God. So a new movement there kept a little bit of the Lutherans, but was primarily Reformed, the German Reformed Church. Now, remember them, we'll get back to them later, but who are the people associated with that? Well, the great Martin Bucer, based in Strasbourg, a wonderful man of God, and some of his works are still being published and translated today. Much of the German Reformed Church was centered in Heidelberg, the new university there, and great theologians like Jerome Zanchius and others. And it was in this setting that two German Reformed theologians wrote one of the best summaries of Christianity ever published, and I highly commend it to you, the Heidelberg Catechism. Very sound, very devotional, and except for its infant baptism, is still one of the great summaries that I would commend to you. Okay, now we come to the post-Reformation era from approximately 1580 to 1700. Not only were there three branches of the Reformation, now in the post-Reformation era, three tendencies within this theology began to appear. Now at the beginning they were in harmony and balance, but after a while they began to have a three-way tug-of-war, and their different emphases led in different directions. What were they? Number one, there was what's been called Protestant scholasticism. What's that? That's basically systematic theology. They would talk about the doctrines of the Bible and put it into various categories and use a certain kind of method, often borrowed from philosophy. Aristotle's various categories of causation, for example. So what they would do is they would categorize them and defend biblical truth. Amongst the Calvinists, probably the high watermark of this was in Francis Turretin. Some of you men probably have some of his systematic theology, the Institutes of Ellenic Theology. Probably the high watermark of Calvinistic Protestant scholasticism. The second of the three emphases was the beginning of biblical theology. Not so much systematic theology where you take the Bible's teaching and categorize it, but rather saying, let's look at the Bible chronologically with exegesis and see how these were developed over the course of God's gradually revealing His truth. Now, a lot of that was associated with a system called covenant theology. Now, it can be traced back to some of the reformers, but it kind of came into its own in this time period, usually associated with a Calvinistic theologian named Johannes Coxaeus. Now, each of these three tendencies later went off the rails, as it were. For example, this biblical theology movement, which is still with us in a wide variety of examples, that opened the door in the 1700s to a critical approach to the Bible. Not one that is rooted in biblical dogma, but began to play fast and loose with questioning biblical infallibility and things like that. And so in the 1700s, this movement produced pre-liberal Bible scholars such as Herder, Michaelis, Reimarus, and others. You don't need to remember those names. They won't be on the test. Okay, what was the third tendency of this post-Reformation era? And I'm going somewhere with this to give us a contemporary application. It was a rise of what's called pietism. Amongst the Lutherans, it began with Jacob Spener. Amongst the Calvinists, you would find it, for example, in the Puritans. When you go over to Holland, you would find it in the Nader Reformatie, and some of them, their writings are being translated and promoted today. And so they said, no, it's not so much scholasticism. Yes, we believe in systematic theology. Yes, we believe in biblical theology. But they said we need the theology to be applied to the heart and to the life. So that was their main emphasis, the theology for the heart. Now, as long as these three branches were balanced together, they were healthy. You had healthy churches, healthy Christians. And here's where I set aside my theologian's cap and put on my preacher's cap. The same thing is true with us today. We need a firm grounding in the Word of God, biblical theology, no substitute. But we also need to know the theology of the Bible. We need to be rooted in that as well, not just exegesis, but theology. But we also need it in our lives. So all of us here, whether you're on this side of the pulpit or sitting in the pew, we need that. Some have said it's like the balance of head, heart, and hand. Well, as these movements began to fragment, they went in different directions and went too far because they were not balanced by the other two. The Christian life has to be balanced, and when we overemphasize one, we do so at the detriment of others. For example, Protestant scholasticism tended to move in areas of rationalism, biblical theology. I've also mentioned how they pulled up the anchor of dogmatic theology and they opened the door to a critical approach to the Bible that became a very unbelieving approach to the Bible. And the same thing with pietism, as we'll see. For example, after about the year 1700, pietism began to go through various movements, and it went into decline, but then it got a shot in the arm in Germany with German pietism. Maybe you've heard the name Count Nicholas von Zinzendorf. You say, who is that? Well, we still sing some of his hymns. You sing a hymn and you say, I've sung this 1,000 times, and your mind begins to wander and you say, who wrote this thing? Zinzendorf, who's that? He was one of the great German pietists, and he started a new movement within German pietism called Moravianism. And he started the Herrnhut Bruderband, that's the believing brotherhood. And here we see one of their tendencies that was kind of moving in a certain direction. Their cry was devotion over doctrine. Yes, but after a while, that became their downfall because they became less and less orthodox, and it became almost a form of Christian mysticism. But remember the name Moravians. We'll get back to them in a little bit. All this is part of the soil of where German liberal theology took root. Okay, then what about the scholastics? Well, they became friendly to another movement that began to arise in the 1600s, philosophical rationalism. What's that? Well, it'd be the age of reason, and its major founder was the Frenchman René Descartes. Now, he was theoretically a Catholic, but his idea was mainly philosophy, reason. Give me Aristotle's syllogisms, but we need proof, and that's what it is, reason, reason, reason. And that gave rise to a movement over in Germany called the Enlightenment. The Germans call it Das Aufklärung. In other words, now it's the age of reason. And just like there's a little child that comes to the age of reason, well, the Christian church has now come to an age of reason rather than revelation. And so we need reason, and this developed in various ways. For example, empiricism. Well, we can't believe something just because the Bible says so or because the Catholic Pope says so. We need tangible proof. We need empirical evidence, things that we can see, taste, hear, put in a test tube, give me empirical proof. This was one of the branches of rationalism. Over in England, rationalism produced a movement that was quasi-religious called deism. And deism said, yes, we use reason, not so much revelation. And they developed a form of theology. God is out there. And since he's out there, we know him by reason, not by revelation, but we really can't know him personally. He's out there. And deism gradually moved into a form of atheism, using this analogy. God is out there, and it's nice to look at him like the clouds in the sky. And he might send a little rain every now and then, but he's out there. But if you've ever looked at the clouds, clouds began to dissipate. And that's the way their God was. He's up there, he's unknowable, and he became sort of a non-God after a while. Deism tended to produce atheism. Meanwhile, back at the ranch in Germany, various German rationalist philosophers like Christian Wolff, Leibniz, and especially one that was kind of the last great rationalist philosopher, Immanuel Kant. And he had a massive influence, but he was like the last of all that, and he kind of went overboard. He made it so logically, rationalistically sound that he was actually nailing the nails in the coffin of the movement of rationalism. Why was he so significant? Well, he set aside all the proofs that had been accepted for the existence of God, but he said, yes, we still believe in God, not because of revelation or some inner burning of the heart, such as the Moravians. He said, but we still have to have morality. And if there's morality, there has to be the moral lawgiver. So he said, that's the only way we know that God exists. Now, that was significant because you'd say, well, what sort of religion did these rationalists practice? Not piety, because they scorned anything with pietism or Puritanism, and they replaced it with moralism. Now, you can see there are people like that today. Oh, they scorn biblical Christianity of the heart, but they say, but I'm a nice moral person. Not piety, morality, and not even a biblical morality at that. You see, they were anti-supernatural. Their cry was reason, not revelation. And they had this fear of what they would call enthusiasm. Now, back then, that was the term that we would today call fanaticism. So when someone came along and said, well, I've been born again and I love Jesus and my heart's been changed, they'd say, you're a fanatic, you're an enthusiast, because that was not part of their philosophy at all. Nothing for the heart, nothing for the feelings, rather dry rationalism. Now, philosophical rationalism was a minority movement, but highly influential in cultured society. If you'd go to the universities, everybody had to study Kant and Wolff and these other ones. And so the highly cultured people, the elite, they said, we're very moralistic and very rationalist. Don't give us this traditional Christianity, whether Protestant or Catholic. We're the cultural elite. And it became very cold. Now, right around the time of the end of this movement in its heyday, brings us to about the year 1790, a major movement began there in Europe. Revolution, particularly the French Revolution. You say, well, where'd all that come from? Their leaders got their impetus from Voltaire and Rousseau, who were deists and rationalists, and they said we need to overthrow the old societies that were based on some sort of Christianity. And so they said we want to bring in reason. And you've heard about the French Revolution, and it got out of hand. Robespierre and his guillotine were filling the French streets with blood. But what was behind all of that was a form of rationalism that got out of control. And they wanted to crown reason as the king and the queen. In fact, when they overthrew Louis XIV in that aristocracy, they took a French prostitute and put her on the throne and crowned her as Queen Reason, the Queen of France. Well, rationalism burned out as a movement as a result in that same decade. And as a result, when the movement of French Revolution failed, the rest of Europe was saying, we don't want anything like that in our culture. And so there was a reaction saying, but what do we put in its place? Rationalism has been spent as a movement. Do we go back to biblical Christianity? People said, we're not going back to Catholicism. We don't want to go back to the old Lutherans and the Catholics or the Anabaptists. That's going back. We want to go forward. And actually, if you looked at the Reformed and Lutheran churches of that day, a lot of them still held to the truth, but because they were trying to counter rationalism on its own ground, they became somewhat rationalistic, cold, dry, lifeless. And so within those churches, now there were people vying for some kind of replacement to that. They said, what do we put in its place and still try to keep some vestige of Christianity? For example, in Denmark, Søren Kierkegaard overreacted against the dry Lutheran orthodoxy in his day and say, there's this cold moralism, nothing for the heart, and he came up with sort of a pre-existentialist alternative. Didn't get very far, but you see, they were trying to say, we want to put something in the place of this vacuum that has been created by rationalism. And so a new philosophy arose outside the churches, and then gradually people started bringing it into the churches. What was this new philosophy that took the place of rationalism? Romanticism. What was that? Well, when we use the word romanticism, we don't need to simply think of love stories, but let's start there. This was the era of the great love stories. Some of you ladies like to read Jane Austen, Charlotte Bronte and her sisters, and Miss George Eliot and others. This was the age of the great love stories. What were they writing before then? Not many love novels. There were some Christian women that wrote books. If you want to read some good stuff, ladies, read The Three Annes, Anne Bradstreet, Anne Dutton, and Anne Steele. Very godly women, and they wrote beautiful poetry and hymns. But those were in the minority. Now this was where women were taking pen in hand and writing love stories. But let me give you an editorial on that. Wherever there is something going on in culture, there is a philosophical background to it. What was the philosophical outlook of Jane Austen, Bronte, and especially George Eliot? By the way, that was her pseudonym. It was a woman. What was their worldview? What were they promoting? Well, you can see it in every one of their novels. For example, whenever they would show a clergyman, they would either make him some cold rationalist that nobody would want to marry, or someone that's living in the past, like the Reformation. And so they would show Jane Eyre, who wants to marry someone that is so loving and that will give up everything. Of course, he has to be some wealthy nobleman like Mr. Rochester. And they will give up everything, and his whole life is to serve Jane Eyre or these others. That's what you find in these romantic novels. But they were promoting a kind of philosophical worldview. What was it? Well, I'm not going to get too far off, but this is a case in point. What they were saying is, like Jane Eyre and these lonely, lower-class, middle-class women, that is a symbol of humanity looking for God. And they didn't want the traditional clergyman God. They didn't want any of that. They wanted a nobleman that would serve them in this emotional way. And that's the romanticist view of God. Well, go home and think about that. Romanticism was seen in other areas, such as in poetry. This was the era of Shelley, Keats, Goethe back in Germany, Lord Byron, Coleridge, and in England, Wordsworth. Ones like this very moving poetry that is maybe not very rational, but very moving to the emotions. And there is an overlap between these. For example, the rise of Gothic literature. Here's a case in point. Percy Shelley's wife, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. And she wrote an interesting little book that had a philosophical point to it. When you read these things, figure out what is the philosophy they're trying to push on you. Well, she wrote this book about this mad scientist, and there's a philosophy who he stands for, who kind of went out of his mind, tried to play God, and he bought parts of dead bodies, sewed them together, and waited for the lightning, and bang, Frankenstein's monster. That was written by Percy Shelley's wife. And of course, the symbolism there is we don't want a God. We want a God that we make, but unfortunately, he becomes a monster that is to be feared and to be pitied. That's a romantic view of the Christian God. Well, again, get off that rabbit trail. What about music? This was another big change from the old classic music, now romantic music, and not just love music, but emotional music. In previous generations, classical music was kind of like rationalism, very precise, very mathematical. If you've studied music, you know that, like logic, all music is math, very precise, and it has to balance, it has to count. But if you look at the previous classical music, such as Bach or Mozart, it was all very technical with these rising and falling scales and counterpoint and all that, kind of like da 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 da. Jesu, joy of man's desiring by Bach. And then this big breakthrough, Beethoven. Pum, 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 pum. Pum, 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 pum. Went right for the jugular of the emotions. Not very mathematical, but you can see how it's a big breakthrough. People that used to go to Bach and Mozart would want to go home and sip cups of tea and eat those little cucumber sandwiches and say, how nice, we've heard a string quartet. Then they go to hear a Beethoven symphony with 75 instruments, clashing cymbals, and afterwards they come out thinking, man, I feel like I've been in a barroom brawl. It was emotional. That's what Romanticism was meant to do in literature, poetry, music. But later, by the way, the same thing, they would move you. If you felt like you'd been in a barroom brawl with Beethoven, you go and listen to Franz Liszt, you want to go commit adultery. You go listen to Wagner, you want to go beat up Jews. Hitler loved Wagner. They all had a worldview that they were promoting in the arts. And the worldview was philosophical Romanticism. I could go on. You could see it in art. It was not the emotionless portraits of the rationalist era. Now it was something that would give rise to expressionism, where you express your feelings and you see something and it moves you. And that's all part of their philosophical worldview. What was it? The key point of philosophical Romanticism was feeling is the main thing. Emotions, that's the main thing. Personal feeling is self-authenticating truth. And they would say, well, I don't know how to explain it philosophically. I know it's true because I feel it. And that's where truth is to be found. And they did not want to return to theological orthodoxy in 1,000 years. Now, some of this got on boats and came to America, but it usually didn't take root until much later in an American version of that called Transcendentalism with Emerson, Thoreau, and others. Now, that's the background. That's the soil, or the mud, as it were, for something else to come in its place. Remember I said that was the philosophical background. How is that now going to come into Christianity to fill the void that rationalism had created? Well, onto that stage walked a man called Friedrich Schleiermacher. And he's usually credited as being the founder of this next movement. In studying this, for example, I read about a dozen or so articles in theological reference books, and every single one of them started off in the same way. Go look it up. They would say Friedrich Schleiermacher was the founder of modern theology and theological liberalism. And they're right. Other ones would also say he was the most influential theologian between Calvin and Barth. Well, I would redefine that and say he certainly wasn't in the line of Calvin, but he was the most influential theologian, bar none, for the entire 19th century. Why is he so important? Because he was the catalyst for a new movement that would sweep Europe just like philosophical rationalism did in all of its branches in the arts. So let's talk a little bit about him and see how he's a case study in this dangerous movement. Okay, his birth dates and death dates, 1768 to 1834. But he really didn't have a big influence until about the year 1799, the second half of his life. From Prussia, which would be modern-day Eastern Europe, Eastern Germany and Poland, son of a strict father who was a chaplain in the army, and his ordination was in the old German Reformed Church. Remember that? Southern Germany, Calvinists. But then the father reacted against that and saw it's nothing left anymore because it had become so dry, and so he swung and converted to Moravianism. You remember that? So it's like the father switched from scholasticism and its dead end now into Moravianism, from the head to the heart, and not much balance. And so young Friedrich grew up in Moravianism, and he knew a little bit about the old German Reformed Orthodoxy, but when he heard about it as a child, he rejected it. And two doctrines in particular that his dad would teach him, he said, I just can't swallow that, Daddy. And the two doctrines were everlasting hell. He said, I couldn't believe in a God that would punish people forever. And the second one was the Reformed doctrine of substitutionary atonement. He says, that's just not fair, and that's just messy, all that blood, and I just don't want that. He believed that even as a child. So as Friedrich Schleiermacher grew up, he studied philosophy, as every German student was expected to. He's read Kant, he read Aristotle, he studied Plato. In fact, he translated the entire works of Plato out of Greek, and Germans still consider that perhaps the most important translation of Plato's works. Meanwhile, he rejected rationalism. He saw that it was a burnt-out movement, and very soon he was attracted to the earliest stages of Romanticism. He was personally introduced to it by Friedrich Schlegel, who became a leader in this movement. Now, here's a summary of what I'm saying at this point. Schleiermacher was the one that was to be credited from taking philosophical rationalism and bringing it into Christianity. He was the founder of theological Romanticism, which later became known as German liberalism. Let's get back to the story here. He was also a pastor for many years, and although a lot of his sermons were published, he was more known as a theologian when he taught at the universities. For example, he helped found the University of Berlin. But one of the young boys that studied under him and learned his Heidelberg Catechism under Herr Schleiermacher was a young boy named Otto von Bismarck, who later grew up and was the one that unified all the German states under the flag of Deutschland, Bismarck. Okay, back to the story. Schleiermacher was, for some reason, bouncing around universities and churches, but he did get ordained in the old German Reformed Church, even though he didn't believe in its doctrines. So he did try to mingle a little bit of leftover Moravianism and German Reform, but his main thing was Romanticism. But keep that in mind, he did minister of a sort in the German Reformed Church. Now, remember how I said that rationalism was very popular amongst the cultured, educated elite in the universities and the government and the aristocracy and all that. And these were people that had a lot of influence, but they wanted morality, not Christian piety. Schleiermacher said, you do need religion. So he said, how do I bring them back to religion and not just cultured philosophy? And so he gave 5 lectures in 1799, and this is usually traced as the birth of German theological liberalism. These lectures were on the subject of On Religion, and then that was probably his most significant book. In 1821, he wrote his masterpiece called The Christian Faith, which is sort of a systematic theology. He also wrote on a wide variety of subjects: ethics, history, church government, and much of that is still in print, and they're still publishing some new manuscripts of his that were never published. Now, he rejected the old German Reformed orthodoxy. He said, I don't want anything to do with Martin Bucer or Zanchius. And he says, oh, the Heidelberg Catechism's nice, but it's good for children, not for adults. I don't really believe all that. He didn't want the old orthodoxy. He wanted a new Christian religion. And he tried to merge a few of these various strands together. Like in 1817, he was very important in the union of the Lutheran and Reformed churches. They became one denomination. You see how ecumenism started at an early stage in German liberalism. As a little sidetrack on this, one little mark on his record was that he had a untoward romantic in the love sense relationship with the wife of another pastor, but he survived the scandal. Now, he is usually considered the father of German theological liberalism, and if you know anything about church history, you know that the 19th century was devastating on the churches. Liberalism took over, dominated, and evangelicalism was on the retreat. Let's look at Schleiermacher's theology. Very obtuse. And I'm no expert, but here's a brief summary of the main points. Number one, what he believed about theology as a discipline. He did not believe theology consisted in dogma. At least that's something he retained from rationalism. He said, no, it's not handed down from the Bible. Doctrine is simply the expression of what we feel, not what we think, and it's not something by a matter of propositional revelation from or about God. So he had said theology is simply the expression of religious feelings. And so it starts with man. In fact, that's how he begins his book, The Christian Faith, starting with man. One short summary of his theology is this. All theology is really anthropology. Not talking about God, but talking about man's feelings about God. Secondly, what was his view of the Bible? Well, he'd say God inspired the writers, not the writings, and it is certainly not an infallible document that we can appeal to. It has myths in it. You see, he was still maintaining some of the old rationalistic, critical views of the Bible, and he says they were myths. For example, look up in his Christian Faith book under angels. And he says, well, these are nice little myths for children. But of course, you can't expect grown men and women to believe in angels with wings and demons and Satan. He also basically ignored the Old Testament because he says, well, we've come of age and we don't really need that. But his main point was the Bible is not our final authority. It's simply the best of Christian writings, but it was the first of Christian writings. And so it was very pure, kind of like the first edition of a novel. You want to go back to that which is closest to the author. But of course, it's not the only thing, and it's not infallible. And so that was a summary of his view of the Bible, and later people built upon it. Thirdly, what was his view of God? Basically, God is impersonal and pantheistic, the all, the infinite. And his main attribute was omnipotence. In other words, ultimate causality. Everything that is happening can be traced back to God, and this is all God does, and this is all God can do. It's simply ultimate causality, and this was similar to what the idealists would later call the world spirit. You'd find that in Hegel, for example. Just as rationalism led to this deism, God is out there. In theology, we call that the transcendence of God. Schleiermacher said, no, it's the exact opposite. God's not out there, he's down here. That's what we call his immanence. So he's immanent, he's near to everyone. In fact, he's in everything. So you can see a sea change in their view of God. What about the Trinity? It is relegated to a 13-page appendix at the end of his systematic theology because he said, well, the idea of the Trinity is somewhat irrelevant and useless, and it's simply a construct that some Christians developed early in the church to describe this God, but it was nice for them, but it's somewhat irrelevant for us. God, whoever and whatever God is, he doesn't really exist in and of himself as a trinity, but that's simply man's expression at one time of what God was. What about miracles? Well, just like the rationalist said there's no intervention between God and us, Kant said there's this curtain between up there and down here, and God doesn't reveal, and God doesn't interact with miracles. Schleiermacher said something like that. He said, well, miracles are simply not necessary. It's an old idea that some Christians invented as an expression of their feelings about God, but we've outgrown that, so we don't really need to believe in miracles anymore. Number 4, what about man and sin? Schleiermacher said, well, there was no historical fall as such. Genesis 3 is a myth, but it's a good myth. It teaches us a lesson, because when we read that, we see Adam is us. And Adam fell into sin, so that's talking about us. So whoever wrote it, probably not Moses, is expressing how he falls into sin, and that's useful for us today, simply as a symbolical myth. What about original sin? No, that's not passed on down to us as inherited corruption. So Schleiermacher, what is sin? I'll give you his English definition. It's God forgetfulness. In other words, instead of having God consciousness, we have God forgetfulness. We forget about God, and we're kind of like hogs rooting around the ground, concerned about pleasure and pain rather than this God that's in everything. So sin is simply God forgetfulness. Number 5, what's his view about Jesus Christ? He'd say Jesus Christ was the only man that had perfect God consciousness. And he's a perfect example for us. He's the trailblazer. And in this sense, and in this sense only, can we say Jesus was God. So if you were to ask Schleiermacher, do you believe Jesus was God? He'd say, Jawohl, natürlich. Yes, naturally. But what do you mean by that? You see, this was a giveaway. The liberals love to use good language with different definitions. So Schleiermacher would say, yes, Jesus is God. In what sense? He had perfect God consciousness, far beyond any of the rest of us. But of himself, was he God? He'd say, no human being is, except in the sense that we're all part of God. But he had this consciousness, this self-consciousness that we should imitate. And so, being perfect, Jesus did not need redemption. He is the ideal example for us. So Schleiermacher emphasized Christ's person, not his work. The work was somewhat irrelevant. And, you know, when we talk about that, that's nice expressions. If that was Peter and Paul and John that wrote these things, possibly not. Those were simply their expressions of what this God consciousness in Christ meant in his life. But, you know, so far as a literal virgin birth, resurrection, that's somewhat irrelevant. It's the person of Christ that really matters. Now, the number 6 point is probably the central aspect of his theology, the most crucial thing of all, summed up in the one word in German, Gefühl. What's that? Faith, or another term, absolute dependence. This is where we need to get out of the swamp created by rationalism and our lack of God consciousness, and we come into our own. And he says this has a religious aspect to it. A sense of absolute dependence on something other than ourselves. And also this God consciousness, that God is in everything, and we need to realize that. God is in this, that, me, you, me, everything. And once we start living and feeling like that, then we make headway. He says it's a kind of spiritual intuition that's not so much rational, that's rationalism, but it's in the feelings. It's a sense of the infinite. It's a feeling that's hard to express, and you can express it in various ways. But let's try to express it religiously, he said. In other words, he said, true Christianity and faith, Gefühl, is not an objective, rational process. It's a subjective thing. It's subjectivism, not objectivism. It's not based upon external doctrine, let alone revelation. It's the other way around. He says you've got the mirror backwards. It's not God speaking to us, but it's us expressing these religious feelings about this God that's in everything impersonally. And he says, since it's in every one of us, all humans have it, and it varies in every culture and religion. So he says there's no fundamental difference between Christianity and the other ones. It simply expresses itself in different ways. So consequently, it said, well, Jesus and Christianity is not the only way, of course, but he'd say Christianity is the best way, naturally. Number 7, what's his view of salvation? Well, he'd say man cannot save himself. He needs this reliance on this all God, this infinite, and man is redeemed by the victory of God consciousness over self-consciousness, whatever that means. What about election? Well, he said, since God is all in all, excuse me, Schleiermacher makes me sneeze. You're supposed to say Gesundheit in German. Jawohl. Okay, back to the message. Since God is in all men are elect. And this is how he proved hell is unnecessary. which was his little boy who heard a dream, and now he's got the philosophical, romantic ways of proving it. He says that everybody's elect. Hell is unnecessary. Everybody will be saved. Jesus is the trailblazer, and we're kind of walking in his shadow. What about atonement? It's not substitutionary. That was the second thing he hated as a little boy, and now he's got his philosophical, theological ways to twist it and redefine it away. So it's not faith in Christ, but it's the faith of Christ, his perfect God consciousness. What about regeneration, Schleiermacher? Well, that comes about by being part of the community of the church. That is, those that are God-conscious ones that are not carried away by rationalism or things out there, but they've got religion and what he called a true piety. Whew. Let's now briefly look at his influence and the reactions against it. He was, of course, opposed by true evangelicals. Now, in his heyday in the 1820s, a young American theologian traveled over there and studied and met some of his close disciples, read his writings, and says, I don't believe this. The young man was Charles Hodge. And if you want a good summary of his opposition to him, look it up in his Systematic Theology, Volume 2. Very good, poignant expose of Schleiermacher. Other evangelicals. What about in the old German Reformed Church? It was hanging on for its life because this movement was killing off churches everywhere, and they were all following Schleiermacher and saying, who cares about Luther? Who cares about Martin Bucer or any of that? Boy, Schleiermacher has broken the chains of that. But there were a few evangelical and Orthodox preachers still left in the German Reformed Church, even after it had merged with the Lutherans. One in particular stood out. Another Friedrich. This is the one I'd call the true Friedrich the Great. Anybody here ever heard of Friedrich Schumacher? Any other preachers ever preach on Daniel? Read his sermons. They're excellent. Daniel, on David, on Elijah, Elisha. He was the leading preacher in Germany for a whole generation. Very eloquent, usually very orthodox. But Friedrich Schumacher was one of the very few trying to keep an old orthodoxy alive. It was a failing cause because German liberalism that Schleiermacher had started began to snowball, and it ran rampant all over, not just Germany, but Europe, and gradually into America. Now, there was another group that opposed him, but they weren't Orthodox. These were the Sacramentalists. For example, there was a young man in the German Reformed Church out of Switzerland. The guy on a boat came over to America and taught at the German Reformed Seminary over in Pennsylvania, a young man, Philip Schaff. Some of you have read his church history. He came from the German Reformed background, came over here closer to Orthodoxy, but he and John Williamson Nevin there at the Mercersburg Seminary started a sacramentalist form of Reformed quasi-orthodoxy. So there are various sacramentalists and other ones opposing him. There was something else going on back in America that, you remember, America was always like one generation behind. Just like a lot of Christians are one generation behind what's going on in culture. And we're like the little boy that wants to run up to his older brother and say, hey, don't leave me behind. Christians always want to be, hey, don't leave me behind. We want to be like the philosophy and the culture in our generation. America was like that, so Schleiermacher and German liberalism didn't have the major impact over here until a little bit later. But something was happening in America during those heyday of the first 30 or 40 years of the 19th century, the Second Great Awakening, which I will address in more detail tomorrow night. That was going on in America, but it had very little effect over in Europe. Nevertheless, there was another revival movement going on in the continent of Europe. It was Le Réveil. Started in Switzerland, spread to France, Holland, very strongly Calvinistic of the old school. You see, God was not through with good old-fashioned Calvinistic orthodoxy, so it had a revival, but not in Germany. There were very few, if any, revivals in Germany. The churches were sinking fast as the Bismarck ship once it was sunk in World War II. It was sinking fast in Germany, and now liberalism was spreading like wildfire. Schleiermacher's views spread in the Lutheran churches, the Reformed churches, and other ones, and within 100 years, most Protestant denominations in Europe and America were dominated by theological liberalism. You see, it only started off with one man and a few others, and it took off, and look at the enormous damage that it did. Now, theological liberalism had different varieties, of course. They weren't all the same. Von Harnack reacted against ritual, for example. But in all of these varieties, you can see the family tree and the family resemblance. They all had the same general tendency. And what was it? Away from the old biblical orthodoxy of the Reformation. We don't want to go to Catholicism. That'd be even worse. And what they did was this general direction that you can find in the various branches of them. It did not want historic dogma or evangelical orthodoxy. Toward the end of the heyday of German liberalism in the early 20th century, it could be summed up by saying, well, what is Christianity? The universal fatherhood of God, the universal brotherhood of man, and just love everybody, group hug all around, and that's Christianity. Not much need for Jesus or a real view of God. Now, also, as German liberalism spread in that century, it further developed that unbelieving criticism of the Bible that even Schleiermacher kept from the rationalists. For example, now they began to develop all these myths that they supposedly saw in the Bible, and of course the Bible's not infallible. Later they began to see multiple authorship of the books of Moses, because of course nobody believes that Moses wrote this. That's what they thought. And so what came about with this hermeneutical revolution traceable back mainly to Schleiermacher was that the Bible is the record of man's search for God, not God's revelation to us. You got that? The old view, even shared with Catholicism, was this is a record of God speaking to us. It's infallible. Now, the Protestants said it's the final authority. The Catholics said no, it's one of several authorities. But they were in agreement that it was revelation from God. German liberalism said it's the exact opposite. It's a record of man's search and his expression for whoever and whatever God is. What about Jesus? Well, he's the perfect man, but not God in the flesh. Now, eventually, German liberalism burnt out, just like rationalism had run its course, just like other fads, everything from the hula hoop to, Cabbage Patch dolls. These fads, they burn out. But every time another one comes, something from the old carries over like leaven. And you know what leaven is. There's an old lump, and you take some of it, and you put it in the new lump, and it begins to spread. And then out of that, you take some, and on it goes with this fermenting yeast. Well, this is a fermenting, rotting system, but something carried over from after the heyday of German liberalism. What basically killed the old German liberalism was World War I. Started by Germany, actually started in Austria and Yugoslavia, but Germany was the major force. But it nailed down forever the coffin that man is good. And then they now have the worst war in human history. So they said, well, what's going to take the place of this liberalism view? Well, it was a new orthodoxy, neo-orthodoxy, Karl Barth. And you know what his background was? The old German Reformed Church in Switzerland, but he no more believed it than Schleiermacher did, and he had a love-hate relationship with Schleiermacher and German liberalism. Well, I needn't go into that. In fact, you don't need to go into that either. That brings us up today. Liberalism, I looked at it in its heyday, but it keeps changing clothes, but the basic direction has always been the same. Not a return to the biblical Reformation orthodoxy rediscovered by Luther and Calvin and the Puritans that we would believe, but they'd say, no, we've got to keep replacing it with something else. So it's like a mulligan stew where they say, well, let's throw in a Kierkegaardian carrot and a Schleiermachian potato, and it kind of stirs up and it takes on a new form in every generation. And we find that today. You can still recognize it. You don't have to drink the whole soup, just one little taste, and you spit it out and say, emergent church. New perspective on Paul. Should I go on and on and on? Liberalism is still around today. Schleiermacher would be happy and the angels weep. Okay, there's our survey and our analysis. Now let's give a theological biblical evaluation. This is where I play the part of the theologian and preacher. Theological liberalism traceable back to Schleiermacher and his ilk is weighed in the balances of Scripture and found wanting. Isaiah 8:20 says, to the law and to the testimony, if they speak not according to this word, there is no light in them. They do not speak according to this word. Therefore, there was not light in them. And there's the pun. Das Aufklärung, the enlightenment. The late John Gerstner used to say it was the endarklement. They were putting out their eyes and walking in Stygian darkness, not the light that the reformers rediscovered. They don't speak according to this word. There was no light in them. There is no light in heresy, including German. Yeah, go ahead and say amen, brother. This is the time and place. What was theological liberalism in its various forms? A false gospel. On every single one of those tenets I recited to you with some reluctance, they were not just in error, they were in gross error. A defective view of theology, Bible, God, man, sin, salvation, and especially our Lord Jesus Christ, and all of that. All of them, I could give you 5 hours exposition why they were wrong on each one of them. A defective view of the Bible, of God, Christ. Their view of Gefühl was not biblical. Faith, salvation, they were desperately wrong. They put false meanings to good words. Schleiermacher was neither evangelical nor reformed. He was just an old-fashioned heretic. And others in his day had the courage to say so, and we need to be like that today. Now, the liberalism that he fostered was the main cause of the demise of Orthodox Protestantism in Germany and elsewhere. Schleiermacher, as it were, came to a crossroads in his life. But instead of sticking with the truth, he said, I don't want to go with rationalism or the old truth. We need something new. And that happens in every generation. People say, I'm tired of the old. I don't want to go to biblical Christianity. Is there something new out there that I can buy, beg, borrow, steal? And the devil, of course, will dole it out in every generation. Schleiermacher did not take a step back to orthodoxy, but away from it. Yes, he rejected rationalism, but he developed something every bit as bad, if not worse. He did not develop a form of orthodoxy, but of heterodoxy. In other words, heresy. What are some of the lessons we can learn from this? I'm not normally given to quoting philosophers, but some of you have heard the famous quote from the Spanish philosopher George Santayana. He said, those that do not learn from history are condemned to repeat the mistakes of history. That's one of the benefits of studying church history and historical theology in lessons like this afternoon. Liberalism was and is a big mistake, and people are still repeating it today. Now, where's Tony Mattia? Tony, say amen. This is where your friend Curt Daniel gets down and dirty. Theological liberalism is at heart basically dishonest. Schleiermacher was ordained in the German Reformed church whose creeds he explicitly did not believe in. That's dishonest. But that's common amongst liberals. They get ordained in a denomination and they swear that they believe in these creeds, these confessions, and they don't even in seminary. That's dishonest. There are Presbyterians in the big Presbyterian denomination. They swear to, or they used to swear to uphold the Westminster Confession, and they didn't believe it. Let me say something to my fellow Baptists here. How many are there today that swear that, oh yeah, they're good Baptists, even Southern Baptists? Upon closer investigation, do they really believe the Baptist faith and message? Do they really believe Boyce's abstractive principles? No, this is common amongst liberals that they sneak in. The Bible warns us about this. They creep in unawares and they take over denominations, seminaries, mission boards. Liberalism, I put it to you, is inherently dishonest because they hold to heresy, just like the devil. Can't come, with his mask off. He has to masquerade as an angel of light. Schleiermacher was very moving. People still like him. But you see, it's an inherent dishonesty because they don't believe their own confessions of faith. Why? Because they do not believe the Bible. And if they don't believe the Bible, they're calling God a liar. 1 John 5:10. But let God be true and every man a liar. They are the liars. Theological liberalism is just lies, a pack of lies. Now, this isn't some anti-German sentiment, because I have a lot of German ancestry in me, and it's embarrassing to have to say the land of Luther became the land of Schleiermacher, and it spread like a missionary force around the world, spreading their theological poison. Now, Schleiermacher came to that crossroads, as I said, and he took the wrong turn. Instead of the old orthodoxy, he went to a new heresy, and there are people today always taking the wrong turn. We need to stand at that crossroads and say, this is the way, walk ye in it, take ye the old paths. And that's a quote from the infallible Word of God. Schleiermacher reacted against rationalism. Well, good for him. But he retained some of it, some of the worst aspects of it, such as a critical approach to the Bible. Now, here's another lesson for us today, friends. The devil is very clever. If he can't get us to go into something, he will get us to react against it and back into something else that is equally as dangerous. So there are people that reacted against rationalism and they backed into, and sometimes with their eyes wide open, into romanticism. That methodology is still being used today. People react against this thing and they'll go and buy something else and they'll miss the biblical middle in between. The lesson for us is don't overreact against some error and back into another one. And that's what Schleiermacher did and took droves of people with him. Something else. You remember I said that the state of the German Reformed Church in his day was a very dry orthodoxy. Most of it was still basically orthodox, but very dry because they tried to imbibe that lifestyle of a cold rationalism. And there is still a lot of cold, dry orthodoxy with us today. Here's our lesson. Some people will react against a dry orthodoxy and they get lured into a vibrant heresy. A lot of young people say, oh, we sing the same old dry songs in our church. Oh boy, if I have to sing Amazing Grace one more time, I think I'm going to puke. And then they hear something that's real jazzy at some youth festival and they get drawn to that because they say, boy, that really touches me. Just like Romanticism did. It goes right for the emotions. No, I'd rather have a vibrant orthodoxy, but I'd still rather have a dry orthodoxy. You know, I'd rather have a lukewarm glass of water than an ice-cold glass of poison. But why not something that's really cool and refreshing for the soul, a spiritually alive orthodoxy? So here's an exhortation, brethren. Keep your life in your churches orthodox and spiritually alive and vibrant. Remember what I said in that previous generation, a three-way tug of war. The pietist said you got to keep the warm heart as well as the Bible and sound biblical orthodoxy. Once you tip that balance, you're going to go astray in any one of three directions. Avoid philosophy. There's our next lesson. Whether rationalism or romanticism, a curse on both of their houses. You know, philosophy is only mentioned by name twice in the Bible, and both times under God's condemnation. Brethren, why do Christians still think we can borrow from philosophy? We need theology that's based upon the Word of God. Where are those two places? Colossians 2:8. Brethren, he says, don't let anybody deceive you with philosophy and empty words. And then the term philosophers is found in Acts 17. Marcel, Paul comes and he's accosted by the Stoics and the Epicureans, and he doesn't go with either one. He doesn't react against one and swallow the other one. He sees they're both wrong. And he preached what? Christ crucified from the Word of God. We don't need philosophy. And anybody in my church knows I am no friend of philosophy. And in case you're interested to know my views, we have about 20 of my lectures on an MP3, Christianity versus Philosophy. Don't chase the latest philosophy fad because they're regurgitated in every generation. And if you go chasing after them, they'll turn on you and catch you. So don't chase after the latest philosophy fad or try to mix it with truth. People do that. That's a fundamental methodological error in the development of theology. People think we can borrow from the world and mix it with biblical truth. You cannot do that. It is fatal to churches, spiritual life, evangelism, mission, and on it goes. But people try to do this. I'll give you an example. Stanley Grenz wrote a systematic theology, which he himself said was evangelical, Baptist, and postmodern. How in the world do you mingle postmodernism with biblical evangelical Christianity? You do not incorporate one philosophy in order to combat another. Schleiermacher tried to use theological romanticism to combat theological rationalism, and people still use that faulty methodology. You don't use one philosophy to fight another one because they're both wrong. Some of y'all used to read Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Russian Nobel Prize winner. He had a saying that I liked. He said, when you're chased by a pack of dogs, you don't call for the wolves to protect you. A dog is simply a little wolf, and a wolf is simply a big dog. Be on your guard, brethren. That's what Colossians 2:8 warns about, whether it's romanticism or emergent church or any of these other ones. At the risk of using a pun, don't let them gaffool you into their nonsense. Don't use philosophy to combat philosophy. You find this in a lot of Christian apologetics. Christian evidential apologetics. That's simply empiricism with a Christian mask, or Christian rationalism. I'm not going to name names. There's some good men using a faulty apologetic method. What are they doing? They're trying to use philosophy in a Christian manner to fight philosophy. And they say, you got to fight fire with fire. Got any firemen here? You don't fight fire with fire. You fight fire with water. You don't fight philosophy with philosophy. You fight philosophy with the Word of God, biblical theology. Next, there are many kinds of pseudo-Christianity. Roman Catholicism, the kingdom of the cults, liberalism. And most of these start at the same place, by rejecting the Word of God. That's where liberalism starts, and that's where it continues. It's part and parcel of their view. That's why we need to oppose it. We need to stand by the infallible, final standard of God's Word, not give 1 inch. Remember where it began with Schleiermacher also. Remember those two doctrines he hated as a young child? Hell, substitutionary atonement. There are young people in churches today like that. And they say, I just can't believe that. And there are older people in the churches. Even in so-called evangelical churches, they're trying to sneak in an evangelical annihilationism. Can't do it. And if you want to know more about that, go and consult Robert Peterson down here at Covenant Seminary, who's written some good books defending a biblical view of hell. Same thing with substitutionary atonement. There are some that claim to be evangelical. Notice I say they claim. They claim to be evangelical, but they do not believe in substitutionary atonement. That's a hot issue now in theological circles. They say, we're evangelical just as much as you are. But if they reject substitutionary atonement, they are not evangelicals that are rejecting that. They are now rejecting evangelicalism. Just like Schleiermacher, and that's how he got started. You cannot reject substitutionary penal atonement and claim to be an evangelical Christian. What is theological liberalism? It is a false gospel. It is not another variety of Christianity. It is pseudo-Christianity. It is heresy. I still like that old book by J. Gresham Machen, Christianity and Liberalism. And he very poignantly and scholarly analyzed the liberalism such as it was in his day, about the year 1920. And he said, liberalism, by the way, he had German ancestry, and it hurt him as much to say German liberalism is not another form of Christianity. It's another religion in its entirety. It's got a different view of God, of the Bible, of Christ, salvation, ethics. He says it's not Christianity. It is Christianity and liberalism, and I would say the same thing today, from Schleiermacher on and all these other varieties. Now, brethren, as I started, I said, I wish I could just stand up here and preach Jesus, preach the Bible. I detest reading liberal theology. Curtis, where are you? I'm gonna beat you up. You were signing me out to go and read a bunch of Schleiermacher to prepare this stuff. I do not like reading liberal theology. I want to go and wash my eyes out with tears. I want to wash my hands in the blood of Christ and say, this is filthy stuff. It's abominable and blasphemous. But for some people, theological liberalism is a kind of theological pornography. They know it's wrong, but they can't take their eyes off of it, and they get drawn into it. Next thing you know, they're hooked. we need to be vigilant and warn against it. Brethren, here's where I close. Stick with the truth. Bible says, buy the truth and sell it not. Preach the word. Never compromise. Defend the truth and warn against theological liberalism. May God grant that for every man and woman in this auditorium today. Let's pray. Father, we believe your old word. In spite of liberalism, romanticism, and these others, your word stands true through all the ages. And with all the liberals that have dared to blaspheme you with their false theologies, they are shooting arrows that never touch you. You remain God. We thank you for your truth. Help us to be vigilant and defend it. Help us to preach it in our families and our churches. And help us to be like the men of Issachar in the Bible that knew the times and what they should do. Help us to spot forms of liberalism in our day so that we might defend your truth against it. In the holy name of Jesus our Savior. Amen.